Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Pesticide Recertification Program. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentations today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Jim Cook with ODOT's Office of Maintenance Operations. Hello.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for the quick introduction and talking about LTAP there. Today we've got 3 speakers for you. We'll start off with Dr. Mimi Rose from The Ohio State University with Pesticide Safety Basics. This will be an hour in core. This hour has also been approved for ISA credits. So if you have an ISA certified arborist license through ISA and would like the hour CEU, please email me at james.cook@dot.ohio.gov and I'll put you on our list. Dr. Rose, you're up. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Well, good morning. I'm going to be speaking on pesticide safety basics this morning. And since I've been given an entire hour, which is a little bit more than I usually get, I actually have kind of a 2-part presentation. I'm going to give you a review of safety basics and even a mini pesticide product update in the middle. And then towards the second half, we're going to talk about do's and don'ts for applying pesticides that kind of reinforces the pesticide safety basics part of my presentation. So let's get started. And there is a bit of a lag time between me and you, which I can see. So if you wonder why I'm pausing for about 2 seconds between every slide, I can see when you can see it. Okay, health effects from pesticides. We're concerned about potential harmful health effects from pesticides. And when we speak of these harmful effects, we generally categorize them in 2 different ways. We talk about acute or short-term toxicity and chronic toxicity or long-term. I'm going to give you an example of some examples of each of these. So not to spend too much time on the chronic effects, but typically these are harmful effects that generally develop from more than one exposure over time, sometimes even very low levels of exposure. So at product registration time, the EPA examines data on products that are the manufacturers put forward for registration, and these are some of the types of chronic effects that they're looking for in that data. Cancer, tumor growth, genetic changes. I'm not going to list them all, but you can read the slide. So this is not to suggest that pesticides cause all these things. Once again, this is what the EPA would be looking for in that test data. Okay, what about the acute effects? These are harmful effects that develop in a relatively short period of time or even immediately. And in terms of short term, we're thinking 48 hours or less. When the EPA registers a pesticide product, they will categorize it according to its acute toxicity category. And there's 4 categories. We're going to see those in a moment. And this determines the signal word on the front page of the pesticide label. So let's take a look at these toxicity categories. So categories 1 through 4, ranging from highly toxic to practically non-toxic, and you can see the corresponding signal word that appears in big letters on the front page of the pesticide label. So danger, warning, and caution. And caution actually can denote both slightly and practically non-toxic. So interestingly enough, manufacturers can actually leave a signal word off the pesticide label if that product falls in Cat 4. But more often than not, I see them go ahead and put that caution signal word on there. All right, let's just take a look at an example pesticide label, and there you go. There is that signal word, in this case for this product, Warrior, warning, which if you recall means moderately toxic. Okay, so what is our first barrier? What is our first line of protection in terms of harmful effects from Pesticides, well, it's personal protective equipment. Wearing your personal protective equipment is the #1 way of protecting yourself from potential harmful effects. And what we see here, the long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes and socks, folks, this is the minimum for every professional product I've seen. And I suspect that you are using professional products. You're not using products that comes off the shelves of Walmart. You're probably not using some of those products for certified organic production. You're using professional products, and this is the bare minimum. So how often do we see people out there applying pesticides in short sleeves or long pants? I can almost guarantee you they're going against label. And furthermore, depending upon the product, of course, more PPE may be required. Just an example of a personal protective equipment statement. Wear long sleeve shirt, long pants, socks, and shoes. Like I said, that's going to be the bare minimum. In this case, this product also requires chemical resistant gloves. So what is wrong with this picture? Okay, so this is a little scenario where the person was applying pesticides in an enclosed cab. Now, I presume that some in this audience, I know this is not an ag audience, this is mostly roadsides and people working for government agencies, but you have some equipment where you have an enclosed cab. And if something goes wrong with the spray rig during the course of your application, you have to get out, right, and fiddle with those nozzles. Well, in this case, you must have that PPE in that enclosed cab with you. Okay, so if you get out, this is what exposure looks like. You need to have that PPE to protect yourself. And of course, if your cab is not enclosed, you need to be wearing the PPE when you're making that application. Okay, when you read a PPE statement on a pesticide label, be aware that the requirements can depend upon the task, so you need to read that statement carefully. It's not unusual to find that the mixing and loading step requires additional PPE because you may be working with a concentrate, or you will be working with a chemical concentrate compared to spraying out the dilute. It's not always the case, but oftentimes it does require more. Now, some types of gear that you might be wearing while applying pesticides are either not recommended or are definitely off label, against the label. So let's take a look on the left there, those cotton and leather gloves. These would never be appropriate for applying a pesticide because these are absorptive materials that would hold that pesticide close to your skin. Also, you're never going to get them out of those gloves once you get it in that material. The sturdy looking boots on the right, now those may not be off label. But if your job is to apply pesticides routinely, I'm going to suggest you want to have a dedicated pair of spray boots for the job. It doesn't make sense to wear your street shoes or your street boots because pesticide can get in the material and it isn't coming out. You can end up taking those pesticide residues home with you. For an effective PPE barrier, it's important to choose the right kind of equipment to use it correctly. Big point, number 3, clean and maintain it correctly. Okay, I used to do phytotoxicity trials in greenhouses, and I have to confess, I would just sort of take my respirator off and the gloves and throw them in a box and put them on the next time I came to the greenhouse. Residues were building up as I used those materials, and I was exposing myself every time I put them on. So it's really important to wash down PPE that you reuse. And then 4th point, can't tell you how many times I've looked at chemical storage rooms, chemical storage cabinets, and right there I see the PPE with the chemicals. There's something called cross-contamination that can occur, especially with volatile chemicals. They get airborne, they get in the PPE, and they're not coming out. So always store your PPE away from the chemicals. I'm going to talk a little bit about how pesticides get into the body. There's 4 main routes of entry, and then discuss the types of PPE that protect you from that type of exposure. So starting with dermal exposure, that's through your skin. Dermal exposure is the most common way that people get exposed to pesticides. And, you know, not too surprisingly, it's because you can't do much without your hands, or especially exposure to your forearms if you're not wearing those long sleeves. So a little bit of data showing you how much protection you get from gloves, which of course protects your hands. A study was done with fluorescent material where the person went through mixing and loading with using a fluorescent material instead of a pesticide. And what they did was have one hand with a glove, one hand ungloved. And when they developed this image, you can just visually see how much more exposure there was on the ungloved hand. Now, I just realized I am not waiting for the lag, so sorry for that. I'm going to start looking at that little slide at the lower corner there. It tells me when you have caught up with me. There's also been quantitative studies done on the protective value of gloves. And in this case, they would have one group that wore gloves, one group that not. They went mixed and loaded, in one case 2,4-D, a herbicide, another case Captan, a fungicide, and the protective value of the gloves was 70 to 80%. It cut down on exposure 70 to 80%. That's quite a bit. One last thing before I move off of dermal exposure, gotta wait for you to catch up with me, is the important take-home message is that pesticide absorption rates through your skin varies quite a bit depending upon the part of the body that we're speaking of. It has a lot to do with how well vascularized, the presence of the capillaries, how thin the skin is, etc. And we can see there's quite a bit of difference. Especially the private parts of the body can significantly absorb pesticides. What's the issue here? The issue is especially related to not washing thoroughly before we use the restroom. I can't stress how important that is. Okay, I'm going to move on to ocular exposure, which is exposure to your eyes. And just want to point out the type of PPE that we wear here, of course, would be safety glasses, goggles, or a face shield. What you want to have is protection of the sides, not just the front of your eyes. Make sure that you have safety goggles are much preferred, or a face shield to flimsy safety glasses, because you have that side protection. If the pesticide label requires eye protection, you must have eye wash. It's actually an OSHA requirement. So if you're using a pesticide with that on the label, with that required PPE, make sure you have eye wash. Make sure that you've replaced the solution when it expires. The last route of exposure, or actually the third route of exposure I'm going to talk about is inhalation exposure. Wait for the slide to catch up here. And of course, the target here is the lungs. This is what we want to avoid, is breathing in pesticides. I know with this audience, you typically don't use pesticides that require respirators. Maybe some of you in the audience wear respirators voluntarily. So this is actually quite a complex subject. The choice of an appropriate respirator, even as best a job as you do to try to read the pesticide label, sometimes it can be difficult to figure out what you need. If you're in that situation, I really highly suggest you call my office. We can help you pick out appropriate respirator. Little word of it, it's very important to understand that if there's facial hair that interferes with the seal, you're not going to get a good fit. And furthermore, there's quite a bit of regulations, laws and regulations, waiting for the slide to catch up. Okay, there we go. If a respirator is required by label, the employer must provide medical evaluation, fit testing, easy for me to say, and training in the care and use of the respirator. Once again, I do understand that most of you don't use pesticides that require a respirator. However, there may be some of you that voluntarily use a respirator and the employer has certain requirements. Even when that is the case, that initial medical evaluation is required, and the employer also has to ensure that the person has training to keep that mask in sanitary condition. The last route of exposure I want to move on to is oral exposure. I don't know too many people that eat pesticides, but unfortunately, people do careless things that lead to oral exposure. Okay, so things like smoking, eating, and drinking without even removing the PPE, let alone washing up. So it is absolutely critical that if you're taking a break to eat, drink, smoke, bathroom breaks, that you wash up. Just waiting for the slides to catch up. Okay, when you're all finished for the day applying pesticides, there is actually a right and wrong way of removing PPE. And of course, this does assume that you're wearing multiple pieces of PPE. So the whole point of this is to avoid exposing pesticide exposure. So the first thing you want to do is keep the gloves on, and soap and detergent or water. You want to wash the outer surface of your gloves, get rid of the residues, move on to the other items of PPE, do the same for those. And then the final step is, of course, to wash the residues off the gloves one last time and remove them. Be prepared to decontaminate yourself in the field as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. When you arrive home, if you're still wearing the work clothing that you had on while spraying all day, you're going to want to remove the clothes and shower before contact with your family. There's been significant research done on dislodgeable residues on things like clothing and shoes, and you just don't want to contaminate your home and family. What about those work clothes that you've been wearing all day? Okay, a couple points to be made about washing the clothes. You want to keep those clothes in a separate wash load from the family wash. Once again, there's research that shows that the clothing pesticide residues can transfer from one item of clothing to another. If your clothing is heavily contaminated, don't try to salvage it. Don't try to wash it. You're just not going to be successful at getting those residues out. Okay, if I were to summarize this first part of my presentation, wearing your PPE and following the label is your key to minimizing risk from using pesticides. That is the name of the game. That's what we're trying to do here. Okay, it is important, I think, for every user of pesticides to be able to understand what the potential signs of pesticide poisoning are. And it's important not to think that all pesticides cause all these things. This is a list of symptoms which can be caused by many different pesticides. So let's start at the top: nausea, vomiting, muscle cramps, muscle aches, diarrhea, headache, dizziness. This should start to sound familiar. If you think about those symptoms, you think flu, and of course COVID as well. Skin rash, swelling, or burns, this can be caused by caustic pesticides. And then the last several symptoms: sweating, chills, chest pains, breathing difficulties. If you think about that, it can sound like heart attack. So take-home message: pesticide poisoning can resemble other major illnesses. If you're in a situation where you are helping someone that's been exposed to pesticides. So if you are a first responder, here's some things to think about. First thing you want to do is get that person away from the source of the pesticide. So if it's a situation where they've been inhaling pesticides, obviously you want to get them out to fresh air. At the same time, you need to make sure that you keep yourself safe. If they are experiencing severe symptoms, especially like the ones that we just discussed on the previous slide, you're going to want to seek immediate medical help. Get the label in hand, the pesticide label, and begin to review it to see if there's anything you can do as a first responder. And of course, you're going to want to take that label to the doctor because there's going to be information on there for that doctor. Okay, very brief pesticide product update. I'll call this a mini update because I'm really only going to talk about one pesticide. With COVID, perhaps some of the news, constant news we had about glyphosate has kind of died down. Glyphosate, of course, being the most commonly used herbicide in the world and used virtually in every industry. Everyone that uses weed control practically uses glyphosate. So, as you may recall, there have been numerous lawsuits. I think the count the last time I looked was over 80,000 lawsuits against the registrant, which is now Bayer, of people claiming that their cancer was caused by glyphosate. So I am not going to go into a long review of this. Going back a year or more, I was giving presentations on this, kind of summarizing the whole situation. I think all I want to do is assure you that this is still a legal product to use in the United States and review the EPA's recent regulatory decisions. So in January of last year, the US EPA completed its regulatory review of glyphosate. So just be aware that every pesticide registered in the United States goes through a review every 15 years. And what they do is they review the human impact, the environmental impact, and they review all the associated data. What they concluded was that glyphosate posed no risks of concern to human health when used according to label. And that's a very important clause there, when used according to label. They also did not consider glyphosate to be a human carcinogen. Furthermore, other key pesticide regulatory agencies throughout the world have taken the same position on glyphosate, and I have a few listed there. So just waiting for my slide to catch up. So I'm saying this means that glyphosate is safe, right? Well, no, that is not what I'm saying. I have to emphasize that according to the US EPA, the human health risk is low, but this assumes that you, one, read and follow the label and wear the required PPE. In a sense, pesticide applicators, if you don't do those things, all bets are off. Okay, the last part of my presentation, I am going to move into a section that I'm going to call pesticide do's and don'ts. And I'm hoping this is going to reinforce basic safety recommendations. So key topic areas for this: applicator safety and environmental safety. So I'm going to start out with applicator safety, and the common mistakes are really basic. Not reading and understanding the entire label, not following the label, and then engaging in careless behavior. So I want to start out a little bit talking about risk. Okay, we use that word risk and kind of throw it around a lot, but when we talk about a risk from a harmful substance, what are the key components of risk? Well, naturally, there's the toxicity of the material, the innate ability of that stuff, that pesticide, to cause harm. And recall that I told you that you can gauge the acute toxicity of any pesticide product that you work with by looking at the signal word on the pesticide label. So danger, warning, caution in that order from the most highly toxic to the least. The other very important component of risk is your exposure. So by that, we mean how much you've been exposed, how often you've used the product, how long you've been exposed, and even where on your body you've been exposed. So recall that I showed you how different parts of the body have a different abilities to absorb pesticides. So I have to start out with the very first do, a reminder that you have to wear the label required personal protective equipment, and of course follow the label. It's your number one way to reduce your exposure, thereby reducing your risk. The next do is, of course, to wear the right kind of PPE. Okay, you need to review your pesticide label to make sure that the PPE you're choosing has the required level of chemical resistance. So for example, the 14 mil nitrile glove shown in the upper right, by and large, probably most of your pesticides used in your industry, this would be an appropriate choice of protective material. But once again, I just have to tell you, read the label because there may be exceptions. Certainly in agriculture, there are certain products where they would need another type of chemical resistant material. And as I already mentioned earlier in the presentation, cotton and leather, never. Medical grade gloves, no, they don't protect you from pesticides. And if you're spraying overhead, that's why I have that cotton hat there. You need something that is chemical resistant for your head protection. So I can't remember whether I pressed advance or not. So let's see here. It looks like I didn't, okay. Oh, I see what's going on. Okay, next do and don't assume that different products with the same active ingredient require the same personal protective equipment. So I'm going to give you an example of an important product. I'm sure most of you in the audience have experience with Garlon or triclopyr as the active ingredient. Same active ingredient, two formulations, the amine and ester formulation. You're probably familiar with the difference in terms of volatility. Esters are volatile, but they're useful because they penetrate bark. Amines, less volatile. But very important difference is their risk in terms of harm to your eyes. They're the amine is highly corrosive. So if you look at that pesticide label, it has protective eyewear on it, whereas the ester formulation does not. The next do is to have eye wash available whenever using pesticides that require eye protection. So Garlon amine formulation, got to have this on hand. It is actually a regulatory requirement. OSHA requires you to have that on hand. The next do and don't is with respect to pesticide containers. If you were to have a damaged pesticide container that's leaking, yes, of course, it's important to find something that you can put that pesticide in, but never use a food container for pesticides. It is against the law and sadly has resulted in fatalities. A service container is something that we temporarily store a pesticide in. It's very important that your service container is also not necessarily the pesticide label, but at least the name of the product, the active ingredient for temporary storage. And by temporary, I mean, say, overnight, not something that you would keep pesticide in for months. That would not be advisable. The next do is what I'll call walk in and spray out. This scenario is when someone needs to spray an area that is densely vegetated. So walk in and spray out is a way of minimizing your exposure to the pesticide. So the idea is that you walk to the most inaccessible area first and spray while you're walking out. So you don't have to walk over the areas that you have already treated. Now, also shown on this slide is some very tall vegetation compared to some lower vegetation we'll see in another, actually I think it's the next slide. Yeah, it is the next slide. Sorry, I gotta wait for this to catch up now. Okay, so when treating very dense or tall vegetation, consider cutting before you treat. And don't then necessarily treat immediately. You're going to want to let the vegetation regrow. So here's an example, courtesy of Penn State University, where they went into this highly, very dense area of vegetation, and I believe it looks like it's privet, some kind of invasive plant like that. And they cut it back in June to the ground and allowed it to regrow. Then they came back later in August and sprayed it. This is a really excellent technique to minimize your exposure as well as to get superior efficacy. I think you can imagine trying to spray that vegetation that's overhead. It's difficult enough to spray the vegetation that's about waist height. And yes, I have a question here. Do you think he's wearing the required PPE? I got this slide from a colleague of mine. I highly suspect that he is off-label there. Here's some more don'ts. We set these slides up, okay? I have to admit that, but it's obvious this person does not have the correct PPE on. And then on the right, he probably has more PPE than required by label, but he decided to take a break and have a little drink there. So definitely a no-no. So once again, if you're taking a break, make sure you wash thoroughly before engaging in any of those activities. And a very important do, be prepared to wash up in the field. So what does this mean? It means that you do need soap, water, and towels out in the field. If you don't have them, how else are you going to wash up? Some people think that hand sanitizer can be used, but hand sanitizer simply is not going to remove the pesticide residues, rather. And it's even possible that that alcohol in that sanitizer acts as a solvent for the chemicals, could help move them through your skin barrier. So do have materials to wash up in the field. I know in this audience, certainly you're going to be in the field away from convenient restrooms often. Don't contaminate your home. So don't wear those spray boots into the home. Do shower and change your clothing before you relax on your sofa. Don't wear spray clothes more than once. Now this needs a little explaining. Sometimes people will wear the same work clothes more than one day. There's actually been studies done on agricultural groups that typically will wear their spray clothes maybe twice. They're going to be spraying that week. It's going to extend over into another day. And they actually found higher levels of certain health problems in the group that tended to wear their spray clothes more than once. So you're going to get small amounts of pesticide residues in those clothing. It's very important to wash them after wearing. And then finally, as we mentioned in the previous part of my presentation, do wash your clothes in a separate load from your family or from your other day clothes. Do train the people working for you. Do practice annual safety trainings, especially for those trained service persons that are working under your direct supervision. Just be aware More than likely, there is going to be required training, annual training for service persons coming up in the next couple years due to regulatory changes, and to cover the safety and best practices for pesticide application. Okay, do have pesticide labels at hand during the application. And just a reminder, a regulatory reminder, all of your trained service persons must have pesticide labels available to them in the absence of a licensed commercial applicator. So if they're making applications, you, the licensed applicator, are not on site, they have to have the pesticide labels handy. Now, we do get the question, does this mean they have to have the hard copies? No, they don't have to have hard copies, but if they're required to use electronic copies, and there's no cellular service, that just isn't going to work. So they just must have ability to read those labels, to source those labels in the field if they're applying. Okay, I'm going to move on to environmental safety here, and common mistakes similar to with applicator safety relate to people not reading the entire label, not following the label, and then a third point, not understanding how or why herbicides can move off target. And I say herbicides because I know in this group you're mostly using herbicides. So let's review how herbicides move off target. I'm sure everybody is familiar with these terms, but it's never a bad idea to review them. Of course, drift we know as the movement of spray droplets on air currents. Also can be volatility drift, which is the movement of the material as a gas or in vapor form. Runoff is when pesticides move across the surface, and the issue there is when they get into surface waters. Leaching is movement through the soil profile, and the issue there is when the pesticides get into the groundwater or perhaps well water. And it's a major issue when it does reach the aquifer because it's cold, dark, airless, and pesticides don't tend to break down in that environment. And then finally, pesticides also can be taken up by roots of trees and shrubs that grow into the target zone, and sometimes injury occurs that way. I have a graphic here that kind of shows visually these different routes of pesticide loss to the environment. Just to kind of review, the target, that is where we want pesticides to go. That's where we want them to do their job and then hopefully break down as rapidly as possible once they've done the job. Okay, so with that little review of pesticide loss, I'm going to go through a series of do's and don'ts on the environmental side too, as soon as the slides catch up. Okay, so first do, assess your treatment area for environmentally sensitive sites. This is very important. Some of the things to be looking for: ground and surface waters, especially working in near forested areas, vernal pools, or surface water that is not permanent. So areas in forests, which in the spring are very wet or underwater. You may think that these are, oh, big deal, these are just areas that are wet now. Well, a great deal of amphibious organisms are reproducing in those vernal pools each spring, even though they may look inconsequential to you. So it's very important to be aware of those. Aquatic organisms, pollinators, endangered species, sensitive crops, these are all important things to know about that may be in the environment near where you're spraying, and of course the human landscape. Residences, schools, medical facilities, these are environmentally sensitive sites as well. Do follow all label precautions and restrictions. So particular attention needs to be paid to wind speeds, setbacks, buffer requirements. So setback buffer, essentially the same thing. That's when the label states that you have to maintain a certain distance from something, most typically surface waters. Soil type restrictions. Know even the types of soils in the area where you will be working. Oftentimes these restrictions more frequently relate to coarse or sandy soils because the pesticides, if they're water soluble, can leach down through that soil profile, especially in those types of soils. And then look for endangered species use limitations on the pesticide label as well. So this will, in more up-to-date labels, will advise you if there's endangered species sensitivities with that product. It will tell you to go to a certain website, enter in your product, and review a map to see if you're working in a pesticide use limitation area. Don't apply, whoops, gotta wait for it to catch up. Do not apply to impervious soils. So what do I mean by impervious? Soils that cannot take up the pesticide, cannot absorb the pesticide. I'm talking about frozen or saturated soils, even highly compacted soils. The pesticide, the soil applied pesticides need to move into the soil. If they don't, they're going to be subject to loss from heavy rainfall. So that's another point. You don't want to apply soil materials just before a heavy rainfall. Never use a product unless it's labeled for your site. Let's let it catch up. This is a big one for protecting the environment. You must, sorry, excuse me for a moment while I get another drink of water. It is absolutely critical, and it's a legal requirement that the site of use is on the label. So here's an example of Pathfinder 2, probably a product used in your industry quite a bit. And it explains that it can be used in woody plants, on forests, rangeland, non-crop areas, including roadsides, etc. I'm going to compare and contrast two pesticide labels just to emphasize how important that the site restriction is. Glyphosate, as I mentioned, the most widely used herbicide throughout the world, comes in very different formulations. So rodeo is an example of an aquatic use label. And if you look at this label, it makes it very clear. It's used in irrigation and drainage ditches, canals, reservoirs, etc. It can actually be used in water. I'm going to compare that with Ranger, which says do not apply directly to water to areas where surface water is present, etc. So this is telling you cannot use it anywhere in water or near water. What's the difference? It's the same active ingredient. Well, as it turns out, it's the inactive surfactants in these products that make the difference. One surfactant is very hard on aquatic organisms, one is not. So always make sure your use site is on the label. My last do, which relates to this topic of use site, do use aquatic formulations for natural areas because it's so hard to predict the presence of surface water. Now, this is a recommendation. It's not an absolute requirement, but if you're using non-aquatic formulations in natural areas, you just have to be very, very careful. Next, never exceed product use rates. This is extremely important for protecting the environment. And also, don't forget that in addition for single uses, there's also maximum annual requirements on the pesticide label too. So you may only be able to use 8 ounces per application, but there may be a total of 16 ounces per year, which will only allow you to apply it twice. Now, if you're not particularly good at math, which is an important skill to have when computing how much to put in that tank, and which is, of course, going to affect your rate. Get help. Get help from coworkers, your supervisor, etc. If the label is particularly hard to understand, I'd even encourage you to contact our program, the Pesticide Safety Education Program. We can help. This is not uncommon. I get an email from somebody trying to explain or trying to understand the rates and what they imply. Next, don't over apply. And I'm not just talking about rate here, I'm really talking about technique with foliar applications. Comes down to how do we spray? This is important for supervisors to train the people working for them. With most pesticides for foliar applications, we want to spray to wet, or sometimes we'll call this spray to glisten, not spray to drip. We don't want the material dripping off the plant, or we've made an over application. Do follow best practices for pesticide handling. I'm not going to talk about all of these due to time, but I am going to pick on a few of these, especially equipment cleaning. What I will say about transportation and storage is the importance of security. Pesticides need to be kept locked up. Okay, don't leave them on the back of your truck. Don't have them bumping around on the back of the truck while you're driving around. And don't leave them unattended when you go for breaks or for lunch. It's too much of a liability. Do follow best practices when mixing in the field. And here's just a suggested best practice, which can help prevent environmental contamination. The simple use of a containment tray while you're mixing chemicals out in the field. So if there were to be a spill, it would be completely contained. On the subject of spills, do be prepared for a spill. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, you need to have a spill kit on hand. And the basic contents of a spill kit, you don't have to have a fancy one that you purchased from a supplier, although those work great too. But you need to have absorbent materials on hand, such as could be the spray pillows, the absorbent pillows, or the absorbent pads. Also could be basically a container of oil Zorb as well, works pretty good. A broom shovel to sweep up the materials, plastic bags to put the material in, and of course, extra personal protective equipment to protect you while you're cleaning up. So just a little advice about how to deal with a spill. The idea is that you are containing and removing the pesticide contaminated material. You're not diluting it, or you're not leaving it on site. So that's why you need the plastic bags. You want to completely remove the pesticide residue and that absorbent material. Okay, do follow best practices for equipment cleaning. I have seen ODA case studies from those involved with industrial vegetation control where people have washed their equipment in sensitive sites, and it has generated problems with rinsate and environmental contamination problems. So just be aware when you clean your equipment or your tank or your empty pesticide containers, this generates rinsate, which is just essentially water with pesticide residues. And you have to be very concerned about where that rinsate goes. What do you want to do with rinsate? Essentially, you want to recycle it as much as possible. So not possible so much with cleaning the equipment because that may have soil in it as well, but whenever you're cleaning a tank or an empty pesticide container, you want to recycle that rinsate into the next tank mix whenever possible. If you have rinsate that is essentially just waste, the next best option is to apply that to a labeled site. So just taking the example for turf grass, if you've applied a turf grass insecticide, have a little bit left over, you can apply that legally to another area of turf grass. Just last point, be careful when, where, and how you clean equipment, especially to prevent environmental contamination. Okay, this brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. If you have any questions about whether your product is registered in Ohio, so just be aware that any products you use must be both federally registered as well as registered with the Ohio Department of Agriculture. There is a go-to website for that. It's called the National Pesticide Information Center. Oops, actually, this is a cut and paste error. I am very sorry. It is the National Pesticide Information System, NPIRS. I'm going to have to correct this presentation that I provided to you as a resource. So just be aware that I will have the correct link. That actually is the correct link. I've just typed in the wrong name. So National Pesticide Information Retrieval System is where you go to find out if your product's registered in Ohio. Okay, the next resource I'd like you to know about is the National Pesticide Information Center. So this is a fantastic resource for learning more about pesticide toxicity. Perhaps you want to know more about a product that you're using, or you want to read more about glyphosate because you have legitimate concerns about it. Go to the NPIC and you can find fact sheets and quite a bit of information. They even have a call-in number that toxicologists answer to. Moving on with some other resources that I'd like you to have, and I'll give the lag time here a moment. Every pesticide applicator should have the EPA emergency spill hotline at hand. It is required to report any spill entering waterways or spills in reportable quantities. But number one, spills entering waterways, remember that and have this number handy. The second on this page, Chemtrek, is a 24/7 technical support hotline for any type of hazardous substance spill. And then the other resource here, G. Phillips and Sons. These are the contractors in Ohio that take and recycle pesticide containers. It is a free service, so it's important to consider recycling your containers with them. And then finally, I offer my program as an important resource to pesticide applicators in the state of Ohio. We're there to answer your questions, whether it's pesticide math or where you can find a research program before your license expires. Just give us a call or send us an email. We'll be happy to help you. So that's the conclusion of this presentation. If our moderators want to give the code for this.
Well, Dr. Rose, I really appreciate everything. I was going to let you know that we didn't have any questions that came in, but I did have a couple of questions myself that I came up with that I'd like to ask you. First of all,
Sure.
we talked about cleaning up pesticide spills and using the clay particles or the booms and things like that. But once you do clean up that pesticide spill, what do you do with the contaminated materials then?
I mean, that's a really good question. The point I made was that it's very important to collect them. That's why you have the plastic bags and the shovels, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to depend upon what the material is. For example, I know a company that the 2,4-D material that they collect, it has to go, it's a legal requirement to a hazardous waste disposal, company essentially. Not all pesticides are categorized as hazardous waste. So it does come down to knowing whether that material is categorized by regulation as hazardous waste or not. So that's sort of a fork in the road. Is it or isn't it? So if it is, has to go to hazardous waste disposal. some pesticide waste can simply be disposed of legally, like in the trash. But I just really have to emphasize it's very important to look that up and consult with your with your waste authority about which way that it goes.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. And then the other thing I know semi-new, but I mean it's a product that's been offered out there for a few years now is Field Watch, and about how a lot of the organic farmers been registering some of their fields and apiaries for bees and wineries and that. What is it? Are there requirements on that we need to really look at when being a pesticide applicant? I know it's wise to do these kind of things, but I mean, do you know the requirements on that for viewing Field Watch and those kind of sites to be able to see your areas?
Yeah, that would have been a very good thing to put into my dues, and I just made note of that. So thank you for bringing that up. There are certain pesticides that direct you by label to consult Field Watch, and it doesn't name it by name, but Field Watch is the entity in Ohio. So, for example, the farmers are required by the dicamba label to do that. So, by and large, I'm thinking that when I speak of dicamba, I'm talking about specific products that are labeled for use on dicamba-tolerant soybeans. So, by and large, you are not required with the vast majority of pesticide products to consult Field Watch, but it's obviously would be a best management practice. If in the process of reviewing your sites before you go out and make an application, it would be highly advisable to consult it. Now, having said that, from the standpoint of the producers and the people that have the sensitive sites, it's a voluntary it's voluntary to put your entity on there as a sensitive site. So you can't be assured even by consulting Field Watch that you've got everything covered. So that's why it's really important to get on the ground and observe what are the potential sensitive areas.
Great.
I hope
great
that was, there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts in that answer. So
no,
I think it is a best practice.
Good, good. And I guess the last thing I was going to add is that one thing I always try to stress to my folks, so anytime we're applying pesticides in a truck, is to have in the door pocket of the truck or above the visor what kind of chemicals they do have mixed in the tank, along with always, of course, carry your SDS sheets and that with it. But in case, God forbid, you get in an accident and you're incapacitated, the EMTs need to know what's in that tank and how to treat you. So you keep your spray mixes kind of listed in a booklet or something like that where they can get at them, because that's the first place they're going to go to when they try to render aid, and it's something to help you out that way. But thank you very much. I have no other questions, so Jim, turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rose. Yeah, I have all the codes, and I add them to a spreadsheet and send over to ODA, so you guys get a break this year, not having to worry about the codes and writing everything down. Go to the webinar or meeting, or I forget which one we're using, tells me when you log in and when you log out. So as long as you're here for that class, I'll give you credit for it. Next up is Greg Ressler with Red River Specialties. We're just waiting on Dr. Rose to pass the virtual baton.
I'm with you here. I'm just in the process of doing it. Sorry, I sleep at the switch.
Nope, that's all right.
That's why we practice this, right?
Yep.
Okay, I think he's got it.
Yep,
Yep, just came over.
Yep, I think it looks like we might be one slide ahead on there we go, yep. So we've got Greg Ressler with Red River Specialties, and he's going to discuss roadside weed control, grass growth regulation with Johnson grass suppression. Greg, it is yours.
Yeah, and good morning, everybody. If you guys, if anybody stayed up late, I understand, watching the game. That wasn't quite the game that Gonzaga and UCLA game was, but still a good game to watch. And man, I just love college basketball. It's a lot of fun. And a couple things, very good presentation by Mary there. It is our responsibility to make sure we protect ourselves and environment. And one thing she was bringing up was that Garlon 3A, and she showed another package of it and didn't really mention it, was Vassland. It's on your guys's for ODOT. It is on your contract. The nice thing about Vassland, it's inert is that cooling technology, so it doesn't have the volatility of an ester formulation, but it's got an aquatic label, and that's where she showed it was on the aquatic side. But it's only got a warning label, so it gets rid of that corrosiveness and the dangers to your eyes. I highly suggest people at least take a look at it, and there is a cost difference, just like in most things. There is a cost difference there, but you might want to take a look at it. Who am I? Greg Ressler with Red River. I am a supplier for ODOT and the state of Ohio, any of you contractors, Indiana and Kentucky. How you get a hold of me is there's my phone number and email address. So I do cover quite an area, and be patient in this time of year. Everybody's wanting to make things move forward. One thing I always like to talk about is you guys are the applicators. Without you guys understanding what you're applying and doing it correctly, these programs cannot exist as spray programs. The consumer, the end user everybody's out there watching you guys. You're on the right of way. You're not hidden in an ag field where they may only see you for a tiny little bit. You're on everybody's property. You guys have got everybody watching you. You have to do these things as far as knowing the label, and that's what these programs are here for. So outstanding program. I watched last week, thought it was very, very good, and hopefully you'll get some good points out of it again this year. And if anybody's got a question, of course, email me or give me a call. But we got lots of partners out there. Universities do a great job of making sure the products do what they say they're going to do. I'm not the only supplier out there, but your suppliers do, I think, a really good job of informing you of how to use the product. The manufacturer goes through years of testing to bring new products out. And when there's a good reason to bring them, then they get certified. And not every product makes it, but that's the job of the EPA and the manufacturers to work together. EcoPack is a blending company for me. They put 2, 3, 4, 5 different products. A lot of you guys in ODOT currently use those products. We'll put them in totes or 5-gallon cubes, and that way you have less exposure for your workers, and you get the right amount in every time. And I can make that come out to even where it's a half a gallon to the acre, a quart to the acre, or maybe it's a full gallon. Just depends what we put in there, how much it will take. Talked about timing. In February, we can do some what we call dormant stem application. In April, that's when I like to see the grass growth regulation. You guys start working on it. We still got plenty of time to do that. You can go right through the do a mowing and utilizing all of your equipment. So that means if you didn't get it all done, you can still either mow or spray. If you do mow, it is important to wait 7 days before you spray a weed control or a grass growth regulation. And if you spray it, not to mow for 7 days after application. Of course, April showers bring your May flowers, so April can be a wet time. That's why I'm not a big fan of putting bare ground out real early, because we do have those downpours. But at least in May, it gets a little more localized. It's a little easier to make that application. June, I kind of reserve for the start period for brush control when we do foliar application. November, we can keep spraying except for maybe a couple months out of the year. We can do what's called dormant, and we're making that application to control unwanted vegetation. Most of the time it's brush that we can push back. The nice thing about doing it in November and December is that we just don't have that brownout. And then of course we can do the cut stump and basal treatments pretty much all year round. It's a matter of making sure you don't have heavy sap flow during that time. Is about the only the spring may be a bad time to do a cut stump because it can push the product right off. Why do we need vegetation managed? You know, we've got a lot of reasons why we do, and we've got native species we're trying to protect, but we have invasive plants, and whether we're mowing it, whether we're spraying it, these are all different tools that we can use. But the main reason is right here: safety. We have to be able to see around corners. That's what your guys' job is yeah, we're controlling vegetation, but we're creating safety for the public. Can they see the signs? And this is real important if you're not familiar with the corner. As I travel a lot, I'm not familiar with every corner. And, you know, and that sign, if it's covered up with brush like that, you know, that's an issue. And, you know, the local people may know to stop, but if I can't see it, you know, that can cause an accident. Also, be able to see around those corners. In some cases, we can use growth regulators and not have to mow these areas that are either very hard to get a mower to, or the traffic is just so clustered there that it would be hard to get a mower in those areas and to be able to mow them safely, because there's a lot of trash in those areas that you're going to end up throwing, and it's just hard to mow those areas safely. Aesthetics. Nothing brings a new business like a good roadside. You know, if it looks, it just shows the county pride, the state pride, and bringing more business into our communities is what it's all about. So making sure the aesthetics is another good reason. Business people like to bring businesses to communities that do take care of their rights of way. Invasive. This is, I know you guys have heard this more than once, you know, maybe 100 times. You know, invasive plants do create a real issue for our native plants, and being able to target them when they're in small clusters instead of a continuous for miles and miles is a lot less expensive. I don't know that we'll ever get rid of invasive plants, but if we can keep it to a manageable level is what we're kind of trying to do. And there's some plants that aren't good for the pollinators. They're just the pollen isn't the same as what they're used to natively, and can actually maybe poisonous to some of our pollinators out there. And I know this is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. You've got the monarch butterfly and bees, all very important pollinators for us in the world of agriculture. So we do need to make sure we protect our native plants. And then what you guys have proposed out there on your state level is these different zones. You know, we've got to keep an area free of trees and obstacles. One of the ways is to use herbicide. Another way is to use mechanical. Obviously, I'm going to be talking more about the herbicide part. but these big territory areas, maybe we don't need to use the growth regulator, but even using plateau can help bring in the native plants and keep out the invasive plants. We definitely want to be using a weed killer, and sometimes we're going to need to use a brush killer or control herbicide to keep these zones free. Tell me what you want and I'll help you get there. One of my biggest things that I try to emphasize, I need to know, it's just important for me to know what you want to keep as it is what you want to remove. Because we don't want to take out the things that you just planted. So this could be done either with a herbicide selection, or maybe it's the application technique that will have to be changed. But this zone is important to know, and how do you want to make it work? And also when you're spraying, do you guys understand where your right-of-way is? I've been out there several times on different DOTs, applicators. It doesn't matter. We all try and do the best job we can. And sometimes we don't really understand where the end of our right-of-way is. We may not have those telephone poles. Well, especially this time of year as everything's greening up, sometimes it is really hard to know where the right-of-way is, because as we spray out in the field, may be awfully weedy, but that's not where we're supposed to spray. We have to know where our right-of-way is. It's important that you keep your droplets on your side. One way we can help reduce drift is to use a drift retardant. We can never do a drift control, but we can reduce the risk of herbicide reaching unwanted areas and keep it on target. And nozzle selection is also important, along with knowing what products to put in the tank. But we do all offer drift retardants to help make those droplets bigger. One thing right off the bat, I like to talk about when we're doing looking at a grass growth regulation. When we get to this level, we're no longer just going for just the weed control, but maybe it is the weeds that are the issue, and we'll talk about that. But it's managing the right-of-way and not letting the right-of-way manage us. We don't want to be just reacting to phone calls. Well, if we manage the right-of-way and we use all the tools in the toolbox compared to just mowing, maybe we can save some time out there and be proactive. We could maybe save as many as 30 weeks out there for one man. And who wouldn't want an extra employee? Mowing's slow because you have to back up. You're probably only going really about a mile an hour when you really take it all in. And unless you got a big back wing, it may not be real efficient, but maybe you're just mowing that first 10 or 15 feet. Well, that's where all the signage is. And so those are areas that we can use growth regulator, but the first part of any good growth regulator is to make sure you got good weed control, because we don't want to get into where we're just mowing weeds and yet the grass is regulated to a certain height that we're wanting to do. What the goals usually are, well, I would like to decrease my mowing. Maybe this is that I don't want to replace all my mowing equipment quite so often, or any type of equipment. We'll have maintenance costs and repair costs. So we can decrease this cost, this mechanical cost, and put it in spray equipment. Spray equipment, very cost effective. We can be spraying at 10 mile an hour compared to mowing at 1 mile an hour, and we can take up to 30 feet at a time. So I know I've been talking to the guys up in the Northwest, where they're talking about even using a tanker truck. And so we can get some real mileage out of those, and utilizing some of your de-icing equipment. We can utilize the same equipment that you've got currently, and be glad to talk to people how to get that accomplished. So let me know. And but when you get to doing a PGR program, I think it's really important to go to a computerized controller. It's the amount of growth regulator like plateau is really critical. We can't in growth in weed control, we can be out there spraying. If we're just using 2,4-D and escort, we've got a wide window there. Growth regulators, not the case. So as we speed up and slow down, the computerized controller will take care of that, and that's really hard to maintain a constant speed in a truck. We got traffic, we got all kinds of things that could cause us to have to slow down, and then and going up and down hills can be really tough when you're in the more rolling territories. Grass height, you know, that's what we're thinking that we want to control is that grass height. Remember one thing about fescue, till it throws its seed head, it's going to grow very rapidly. And that's sometime in that June time period. So if we can help reduce that growing and take off that seed head really kind of starts telling the tale of how tall that grass is. So once we get into the later part of the year, if we mow it, we're not going to have that rapid regrowth. And compared to if we use some growth regulators, we can really slow that down. In plateau, I usually tell people it's about an ounce per month. We do have to be careful out there. Your crop in the right of way and on state properties, it doesn't matter what state you go to, the turf is not going to be the best. And so when we're looking at this, we don't want to set it back too hard. We normally I suggest using a 3-ounce rate to start with of plateau, and then there's some other molecules we can put in there. We have to be careful of, let's say, like an escort, that's a sister chemistry to plateau, that can be a little rough on your fescues. We may want to get that down, but as you can see in this chart, just mowing or just leaving it go may not be acceptable. Again, what do you want to accomplish? Where do you want to accomplish it at? There's some areas that you can let go, maybe around your guardrails and signage. You want to keep that clean. But again, we need to make sure of the weed control. Lots of different, this was done in Indiana. We did a survey, or we did lots of different plots with lots of different herbicides out there. And if you look at the bottom part, there's lots of charts down there, or lots of lines down there. What my point is on this is that there's lots of good chemistry out there. What it's our job as suppliers is to make sure we get you on the right track to hold the weeds down for as long as we can, but not have any off-target issues. So my two main chemistries, perspective and viewpoint, are no longer being made, but they're that was a blend of herbicides. So it had method and arsenal and escort in it, depending. Well, now we can, but a lot of these are liquid now, except for the escort. We can do custom blends a lot easier. So starting out with either a milestone or a method, and Milestone now has a new formulation. It's called TerraView. Very, very nice. You should take a look at it. A product that will help pick up some species that Milestone by itself would miss. Method and escort's a really good choice to pick up weeds. If you have a little brush that you'd like to control at the same time, like behind your guardrails, I usually highly suggest you starting out with method. It's a little more. It'll really control your brush if we get the rates correct. So that's our job as reps out there, whether you talk to the manufacturer or your supplier rep, to get you in to the right amount of herbicide per acre And then it's your guys' job as applicators to make sure your equipment is properly calibrated, so we're not causing unwanted death to the grasses that were. It does no good to control everything and then ruin the grass in the meantime. We have to make sure we keep that in mind. And surfactants can make a lot of difference also. So here's a couple months of lots of different herbicides. Most of the stuff will work. We just need to know, what do you want to control, what's your goal out there, and how long do you want to use the growth regulator. And I'm going to talk about one weed that we're having some issues with. That's going to talk about foxtail here in a little bit. But the wild carrot we can remove. Both milestone and method are very good on it. And I like the TerraView a little bit better than just the milestone itself, which is a new product which isn't on here. But a lot of you may have started out with just 2,4-D and Escort. The problem I see with a 2,4-D and Escort, the longevity isn't there to hold the weeds full season. Here was my first plot, but I did this back in 2000, is when I entered into this industry. I've farmed all my life, and the farm had to shrink. And so then I got a job with a supply company, and now here with Red River. This was on my farm here, as you can see here, right there. This was not mowed. And so the first time that I ever sprayed a growth regulator, just traumatic. Now, I had Escort in the tank, and like I said, you can see a little browning in even the grass. And I'm talking about using mixes that now we don't see that browning, but most of that brown is just the controlled weeds that we just never got to that level of control using a 2,4-D type of herbicide. And back then, the herbicide of choice was Tordon. We no longer really use that on roadsides. It's got some issues. One, it's a restricted use product. Two, it moves pretty easy compared to the new herbicides like Method and Milestone. Now, Mary mentioned something about the ground being able to absorb the herbicide, and that's a great point. There's two places where I see off-target issues the most. One is in drift, and another is when the ground is saturated, and then you get a rain right after it. That is one place where we really have issues, is where it moves off target. If the ground's already saturated and then a hard rain comes, that herbicide's just going to move right off. I don't care what herbicide plan you're using, but if it can't be absorbed into the ground, we can't hold it there. Here's another plot. You can see right to the edge. Again, this was done well, it says 2002. So this was early in. So I've been doing this for quite some time. Be glad to help you out. Here's a 1 year after application and 2 years after application. What we're really looking here is at the weed control. And because they did, it's tough for the guys not to mow when you got contract spraying, the contract mowers, so they're going to get mowed. One thing I wanted to point out, look at how the weed control is just very, very good. Once we get away from this edge, look on the right picture on the right side. That's where you guys are going to have the most issues, right along this edge. Why? We got all this water that runs off the roadside. Temperatures are increased along this roadside. And then what's the biggest thing? Very little competition. And so that causes us, let's see if it'll move to the next slide. It won't, so I have to take off my pointer and just go back to normal. Okay, so now it should move. And it didn't. There we go. Again, this is using the herbicide. Again, I'm just going to use the arrow here, and you can see right along this lane is where we're having the issues. Here's just a mowing, and here's where we use standard mowing, again, without any herbicide control. Yes, we get instant gratification, but if we use some herbicide with it, maybe we won't have to mow. I do have a question here. If we wanted to only mow once or twice a year, how often would Greg recommend spraying with PGR? Yeah, that's a very good question, and I will get to that here in a little bit as we go through the presentation. But if someone can make sure I do answer that question, be great. But here, with anything, you've got the problems. And again, what I talk about is here. How do I solve this? What do I do to solve this? Well, one way is I've got some of the guys, and a boomless nozzle is not perfect at all. And the pattern on it, I mean. So if there's one weak spot behind that boom buster nozzle, I hope I have a picture of it because I can show you the pattern of it, is that it's a little light right here in that first 3 foot. The droplets get big, and there's plenty of herbicide that comes out as we reach farther out. So we've got competition here. We've got, or we don't have competition here, so that's where weeds want to come. And we're probably a little light on the herbicide. I suggest most applicators maybe putting on a half-rate nozzle to spray this first 3 foot. Even if we ding up the grass a little bit, what we've accomplished is get rid of all these weeds. So the grass just isn't, as you can see, we got lots of little bare spots everywhere. We got gravel area right here. So another half rate, and we're still well within the label, but you might have to live with some dinging of the grass. Again, what are you willing to live with? There may be a little collateral damage to the grass. We're not going to kill it at another half rate, but 3 ounce rate, if we're only putting out there, because on the roadsides for the county, I spray them at 4 ounces. And in those solar farms where I don't use any escort, is that I'll get up to as many as 5 ounces of plateau, but I can't use the escort once I cross into that above anything above 4 ounces. So lots of different ways. Just again, what do you want to accomplish? What are you willing to withstand? So we can get up there. Now, here's where I wanted to talk about some issues. Is again, I'm just going to use my little oh, hang on, went too far. Okay, wanted to get to the cable barriers. What we had there, and you can see it over here on this right picture, is foxtail. So what we had in Ohio and Van Wert County and a couple of these western counties, a lot of foxtail, all came up right here. What you guys got in, at least in the Van Wert County and All Glades and some other counties here on the western side, is that these posts were put into a blacktop. Well, what happens is, and that's a great thought, to put blacktop here to control the vegetation. Unfortunately, weeds can grow in any type of environment. And so what was going on, it's just that foxtail is a late germinator, and we had nothing but foxtail growing in the cracks of all that blacktop area. And what we're planning on doing this year to help control this is we've got a couple different ways. And I've got some of the costs for the different herbicides on, I think it's the next picture. But probably the most cost-effective way to do this is to make a second application. And if we're going to do that, we got to understand what the year is going to look like. Foxtail comes up late. It germinates sometime in that June time period. We cannot put enough plateau on to control the foxtail in the spring. So we got to make that second application, but we've got to wait till it comes up. So we're talking mid-June, maybe July. Come in here and spray this. And maybe the foxtail out here doesn't really bother you because it's barely going to get up to that first cable, but around the guardrails and which is a lot closer to the roadside, then we may have an issue. We got to keep those guardrails clean. And if we make the second application, we can do that and control the foxtail. So, but it's going to take a second application, and you're going to have to make sure it's a priority, or you're always going to have that. I don't know how many years it's going to take to knock that foxtail back, but shoot, I've been spraying since I was 18 years of age, and I'm still spraying for foxtail. So lots of seed head there, lots of seed in the ground. Again, it's about keeping stuff managed. I don't know that you can ever get rid of unwanted foxtail. Well, here, yes, this is what I want to talk about. The second application. So we're looking at plateau, maybe, probably we'll just start with 2 ounces. We got to wait and see what kind of year we have. We may not be able to spray it at all if we have a real drought. We may just have to live with it because we don't want to kill the grass unless you're going to make a direct application right at the guardrail where the foxtail is going to grow, or the cable barrier. We could do it that way then. But if you're going to spray just clear across, 2 to 3 ounces, all we're going to be able to do. We need to put some sunset or MSO to get into that foxtail, which an MSO or an oil can damage your grass. But you know, again, it's about what you're willing to live with. What can you do? But there's your cost. Some other products that can be used. Drive is more for your crabgrass and foxtail control. You got to get up to 64 ounces. Oh, that's like $65 an acre. You know, you might want to try it. Again, you'd want to be very targeted in your application. But you could put some plateau with it. Again, the plateau isn't driving up your expense. Plateau only runs like $1 an ounce. So depending on how much you're wanting to put down, but again, you got to put some MSO with it. There is a product by BASF. It's called Frequency. It's got an expense per acre also that you may not be able to withstand. I thought plateau makes the most sense when we're making this application. All of these will require that application in July time period to be able to hold it. Grant, well, I did mention this at the beginning. You know, maybe we're just looking for seed head suppression. We can probably get that. That's what we're trying to go for here at that 3 ounce rate. You get the full year of seed head suppression. But we're going to get some growth regulator with the plateau, and we're going to see that on tall fescue and bluegrass and brome grass and wheatgrass. This slide here comes from Jim Beam from BASF. I'm unfamiliar with wheatgrass. I've seen brome grass. It's going to break. Brome grass is going to break probably after about the second, no more than 3 months. Your fescue is going to be well controlled because one, it just kind of quits growing anyway. And your bluegrass, bluegrass is pretty easy to control with your growth regulators. Other species that I've always been surprised at what it will do, but we're at the low end. So we're never going to control it, but we can see some suppression. For one of the big things would be your Johnson grass. And so when you're looking at this, just realize you're not going to control it. We're trying just to get that seed head knocked off, but it is going. The Johnson grass is going to have to be growing. So if you got one of those areas, you may want to mow first. Wait till that Johnson grass comes up, and then spray it, or maybe wait till that again to make a second application. Now, in Phragmites and Cattails, I highly suggest using Arsenal for control. Usually those are so thick that we need to remove them, but we might be looking at some just some seed head suppression that we can get with Plateau, but we are very low on the rate. Normally we would like to see that at 6 ounces. We do have to use methylate seed oil anytime we're going after these non-native plants like reed canary grass and Johnson grass. And we can get on, I know on reed canary grass, we can get some control before it comes up on the reed canary grass, and it'll help hold it out. Some people go in there with glyphosate and take it out and then get some more control as we go on. Another question, will Outrider do anything at all on foxtail? It's not, I'm not sure on that, but we cannot put Outrider with Plateau. It would require a second application. I know we're normally looking at spraying Outrider for Johnson grass control. I just don't think Outrider picks up the foxtail, but I need to read the label on that. But that is a good alternative. Just remember, you can't spray Plateau and Outrider at the same time. That would need to be a later application, which you're normally going to do anyway for your Johnson grass. Let's see. Well, some of the results that we found is after one application made in April, and even in your weather, the weather means so much to how fast the grass is going to break. So if we go up to that 3 ounce rate on the state roads, 4 ounces on county roads, we can expect to reduce our mowing to maybe just one mowing in the fall. Again, it just depends how picky you're going to be, what your goals for that right of way. It's going to grow a little bit, but will it grow enough to be an issue to get into line of sight issues? The big thing is grass really the issue? A lot of times it's your taller growing weeds, your foxtail, your Johnson grass. That may be more of an issue than what your bluegrass and your foxtail is. We may need to look at just getting that controlled and under so that we can get back to growing just fescue. So anyway, that's a Plateau method. What I like is, and I got rid of the escort to have that browning out, was Plateau and method. I'm sorry, Plateau with method and milestone, and that way I can reduce and literally take out the escort. And I had the escort in there for the chicory along the roadside, which is usually very bad. And escort's just a really great herbicide for those areas along the road for the chicory that really causes us problem. And then also by custom blending it, we can make sure we get all the right product at the right rates, and you don't have a bunch left over. And that can be an issue too. But always remember, you do need a surfactant to help get it in. Don't need a harsh surfactant like an MSO early in the spring. We can get by with just a not a good 9 surfactant. If we're going to spray it later in that second application, highly suggest an MSO with Plateau, because we're depending on the Plateau to bring in control for the foxtail and give us seed head suppression in a second on this slide. One other thing, yes, well, I've got it on. Weed control, milestone or method product. It is a little more expensive, but we're just not going to see that brownout that we're going to get if we add the escort with the plateau at that 3 ounce rate. And that's your first step. You need to save that grass, and then just put an non-leak surfactant. And don't forget about your drift suppression products. You do need to keep your product on your side of the road and keep it on target. Those really help. Even those big boom buster nozzles will have fines. The whole idea is not to make the big droplets bigger, it's just to make the small droplets bigger. And that's kind of what it does. Now, one product I did want to mention that I've just been using myself on the farm, it's called something else, but it's called Detail. And it only takes an ounce or two. You don't, it does the same thing as what a heavy rate of MSO will do, but it's very friendly to your grass. Putting an ounce, I'd like to see 2 ounces more on your Johnson grass control. It will really help your plateau in that seed head suppression. It's expensive per acre. As you can see here, it's going to be about $5 an ounce per acre, but it just makes a big difference. I really saw a big difference when I started adding, I can't think of the farm side right now, but the same Detail when I was trying to take out mare's tail. And it just made a huge difference. And adding the MSO is critical when you're putting Detail in there. And you're not going after the Johnson grass till maybe that second application anyway, or much later in May. So I'm not worried about the grass getting dinged up at that time because it's already starting to harden off. I mentioned TerraView. It's going to add a little bit to your cost, but it's going to pick up a lot more weeds than a milestone by itself. I've never used TerraView and Method together. I'm not sure there's any real need to. I'd pick one or the other, like the Method for brush control, and I like the TerraView for weed control and less off-target issues. Drift management, Mary already covered a lot of this, but that's its job, is to make these small droplets larger. I'm going to keep moving here. Who's responsible for drift and use the applicator is. Here's what that Detail will do on that Johnson grass. This is at a 3 ounce rate with just 1 ounce of Detail. I guess Jim Bean with BASF is much more familiar with Detail. He made the suggestion of just 1 ounce. So there's what we're looking at. We're not going, that plant will probably survive it, but it definitely took off the seed head. Another point is Escort is excellent on cedar trees. So if I've got a lot of cedars out there, I'm going to want Escort in there. But man, you add some Detail in there. Both of those products, coverage. We got to get each and every plant covered to get that kind of control. All right, let's see where we are. Creating pollinator habitat. That's a great place to put in your corridors. That edge along the farm, next to the farm field, back away a little bit, so we're not getting herbicides into that farm field. Leave it more of a natural area. You may need to do some spot treatments for invasives, but I think that's a program that is working in many states. I'm not sure what Ohio's rules are, but you do have to keep your herbicide on your side. What we did here, we're looking at controlling a lot of the weeds in a solar farm. We're using the growth regulators, and then and now one thing to remember, I can never shrink the grass. That's what my problem is in some of these solar farms. The guys won't let me get out there as early as I would like to, and then they wonder why I got seed heads out there. Well, plateau is not going to shrink it. So then So you're already tall and thick out there. You got to mow it at some point. Again, 7 days before and 7 days after. So if you're going to mow it, you need to wait 7 days. If you're after mowing, you got to wait 7 days before you spray. If you spray it, then you need to wait 7 days before you mow it. Here's this is also from Jim Beam. We've created what you guys are doing. You're creating thousands of miles. I mean, that roadside area of great corridors for pollinators right away. Some equipment. Here's that boom buster nozzle that I was talking about. In both of these pictures, what you can see is just a little bit light in that very first part. That's why I like a half rate nozzle. They come in like 3-footers. I do have those, and it does a great job of helping pick up all these weeds. There's new and better, if you're going to be spraying on the right of way and you got like a 4-wheeler, there's some great nozzles out there. We don't have to use just the boom buster nozzles. These are called the XP boom jets from TJEP. Those give you a great pattern with very few fines. Some specialized equipment, like down here at the bottom, you can get these extenders to get closer to your target. Shipping, we can blend all this product in containers. To the right is the 5-gallon cube. A lot of you guys are getting those. And then you get the your big batch in these returnable, refillable totes. And then you use the 5-gallon cubes as your service. I did want to give a shout out. Jim is retiring this year. Lots of years of knowledge. Him and I have been doing these online seminars for a long time. So we have had practice in doing it, but just wanted to shout out that if you're needing to get a hold, and I'll be more than glad to give you his contact info. In fact, I'll put it on the PDF that I'm going to send to ODOT. So you guys can have his contact. I'll put it on this slide. Great guy. Taught me a lot about technology and how to utilize it to get our message out there. Here's my contact information. Again, Selma order. Nice thing if you send it to Selma order. Oh, that should be orders. Sorry about that. It needs an S behind the order at rrsi.com. That goes to my warehouse person and to me both. So probably a little easier to make sure you get your product in time. Questions? I know that was a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you covered a lot of good stuff there, Greg. I appreciate it. And I said, actually, you've answered most of the questions that were actually submitted by the audience in that, but I did have a couple other questions. I know back in your one mowing slide, you had price comparisons, and that was for one mowing. And like you said, I think you kind of followed up with that those prices, that savings can be doubled then if you save 2 mowings or 3 mowings and double or tripled.
Yeah,
I think that's something to consider in that way.
I can see if I can go all the way back there. That's an interesting. I'm not even really sure how many mowings that was. It was just one cycle. Yeah. So I mean it's not so much the money for you guys as it is manpower. You guys just can't get everything done, and really there isn't a lot of difference between any of the herbicide combinations. It's about what's your goals. Work with your supplier. We all do a good job of knowing the chemistry. If they can't help you on a particular one like the Outrider, I'm going to need to go back and read the label, Scott. And, it's hard to memorize all these labels. Outrider is one of those things I'm very familiar with, sell a lot of it, but just don't have that label down quite like I do some of the others.
Yeah, not a problem at all. And one other thing I'd like to point out too, and it sounds counterintuitive, but I know with everything with the monarch butterfly and trying to get milkweed established, but we do still have to control that milkweed. Let some of the other listeners know that, but we have to control that milkweed in that area where we mow multiple times a year, because
last
thing we want to do, last thing we want to do is
you do
have
want to control it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, the last thing we want to do is have that monarch lay its eggs on an area where we mow all the time and start
Good
wiping them
point.
out. But
Yeah,
we keep the we need to have them back here in the areas we don't mow all the time. That's the thing too to think about.
Okay. Yeah.
And,
Well, Milestone's not very good on milkweed, so that's where the TerraView comes in, or you go ahead and switch to the method. And but Milestone does not pick up milkweed, and neither is 2,4-D. He'll bow it, and he'll bow the wild carrot or Queen's and lace, whatever you want to call it. But that's the problem with the 2,4-D. I know it's inexpensive. I know you can get some quick knockdown, but if you can at least go out there for a year or two, get a lot of these perennials under control, you might be able to come back. But you know, coming back is so expensive, Scott. It's just not worth it now with the foxtail. That again, it just comes down to you. Do you want to use a weed eater, or do you want to use your sprayer, or do you not care? You know, and if it's far enough back, maybe it's not an issue. And that's why I'm wondering, is it really an issue on them cable barriers if it's so far back? Do we just need to look at the what's up around the guardrails? So what are you guys doing on the Monarch? Are you leaving strips unattended?
Yeah, on the backside. I think Joel Hunt might be on here. He's our beautification specialist on that. But yeah, we're leaving certain areas. We're usually taking care of everything 30 feet off the right of way, and then or on the backside of the ditch is where we leave go on that. And that's where we're usually mowing just once a year and doing selective weed control back in those areas. Try to keep the woodies out, and also try to keep on noxious invasive weed species out of those areas.
Right.
But one thing I would like to really help everybody with, or remind everybody about with, is that you really do need to seek out working with Greg, working with Stacy Songer or Steve Gray or any of the other representatives we have on our contracts for ODOT contracts, but then also folks are not on the ODOT contract. Please seek those folks out to help you with all the different herbicide mixes and blends they have. They have a lot of good things they can help you with on that. I did have another question came up, said, I'm confused. We can mow 7 days after applying a PGR and have the same results. Is that true?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. You just need to wait for that herbicide to move down into the root zone, because when we spray it, translocation needs to happen. So if we mow it like the next day, we're going to lose a lot of our herbicide. I'd say most of it's going to move within 24 hours in a growing, if we got good growing conditions. But you know, I need to put out there, well, you know, it gets cool, and so if the plant's not growing, it's not going to translocate. So yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
All right. Well, if there is no other questions, Jim, I mean, if you don't mind, maybe we can go on a 5-minute break before Dr. David Gardner comes on and does his presentation.
Yep.
Yeah, we can take a few minutes here. We're moving ahead a little bit so that everybody can take a break and stretch their legs if they haven't, or grab something to drink, use the restrooms, whatever, and we'll start back up here in 5-6 minutes or so, around the 10:30 mark.
Okay,
well,
sounds great.
And I just wanted to, one last thing was, I really enjoyed these, reaching out to people and be glad to work with people and come out. We're going to be traveling this year. I'm going to be traveling this year, and be glad to stop by and work with you. And you know, that's how we keep these programs going. If you reach out to me, and we'll fill your orders. Thank you.
Sounds great, Greg. Thanks a lot.
Yep. See, I need to pass this on, man. Let's see. Change presenter. There's David. Okay, David, did I think I passed it on to you?
I think you did.
All right. Good luck, and I'll be listening to your program right after the break.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, just about 10:30 here. Next up is Dave Gardner from The Ohio State University. He'll be talking with us about managing lawn weeds throughout the year in your yard. Those of you that have Category 8 turf, this will be the half hour for that. Greg's was Category 5. For reference, if that's what you were wondering what that was. Dave, the podium is yours.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Now, I've been employed at Ohio State for 20 years, and this is the first time that I've ever given a presentation to this particular audience. And so I do program planning for the Ohio Turfgrass Foundation Conference and Show, and every now and again we try something new and different, and sometimes that goes really well and sometimes it doesn't go so well. And so I'm hoping that this goes well. And I suppose if it doesn't, at least you get a half hour of Category 8 credit, assuming that you have that on your license. But hey, let me just go ahead and get started. Talking about managing lawn weeds throughout the year. So kind of like controlling weeds in roadsides and right-of-ways, but a little bit different, right? As with other weed management systems, of course, the important thing to keep in mind is not only to identify the weeds that you're having problems with, but also you have to know what type of weed it is. Is it an annual? Is it a perennial? If it's an annual, is it a spring annual or is it a summer annual? And the reason I say that is because one of the most common mistakes that I see folks make when they attempt to control weeds is they can pick the right herbicide based on the identification of the plant, but they spray it at entirely the wrong time of year. And so people out spraying crabgrass and spurge and other warm season annuals in September and October after they've already set seed and it's fallen to the ground to make this year's crop. It's the wrong time of year to do those kind of things. So it's not just identifying the weed that's important. It's recognizing the life cycle so that you can make sure that you're putting those herbicides down at the right time. Now, I'm presenting this kind of in a calendar mode, so I was going to go month by month with those things that I would recommend for good lawn management. And the two primary activities for the month of April are either your pre-emergence weed control if you have issues with crabgrass, or a lot of people will attempt to seed or overseed at this time of year, which it's just a terrible idea to do that. The fall always has and will continue to be the best time of year to attempt to establish turfgrass from seed. The reason for that is that you're going to have a lot of competition, pressure from germinating annual weeds like crabgrass, and the summer annual broadleaf weeds. And in addition to that, even if you can get the grass to establish, then the root system isn't going to be mature, and so you're going to have to pay careful attention to watering for the entire first summer that you're attempting to grow that grass. So for a variety of agronomic reasons, we say that the best time of year to attempt to establish from seed is August, September. People do it at this time of year, but it's just not a good idea. Now, as far as the one thing that you should be doing, though, if you've had a history of problems with these summer annual grasses, crabgrass, goosegrass, yellow foxtail, or barnyard grass, really the list of weeds that we have a problem with in turf is restricted compared to other agronomic systems because of the mowing. There's just only so many plants that can survive the height of cut that we maintain yards, golf courses, and sports fields at. And so, these are the four that we primarily have a problem with. And in fact, the crabgrass is usually the big problem, and these other three, they're there, but by far and away, they don't cause us as much problem as crabgrass does. So crabgrass, it's a warm season, annual plant that is tropical in nature, so it can only persist here from seed. It cannot overwinter vegetatively. After it sets seed, it's got a great competitive advantage in the summertime, right? Because it's hot and a little bit drier, and so it can do a lot better than the grasses that we're trying to maintain as our lawns. But then in the fall, after it sets seed, it dies, leaving these voids of purplish dead grass and or bare ground, right? And so we typically expect crabgrass to germinate sometime the first part of May. in this part of the country. Now, that's not to say that you won't see a little bit of crabgrass germinating even this week. You know, we're going to have, you know, highs approaching 80 degrees here in central Ohio this week. And in microclimates, you know, like heat sinks next to sidewalks or, you know, south sides of buildings where you've got reflected heat and light, you know, you might see the soil temperatures getting a little bit warmer. And so you might see some germination in April, but usually that crabgrass is damaged or killed by late season frosts. And, you know, again, the main flush of crabgrass germination tends to occur during the month of May and even the first part of June. So, you know, one thing that I try to tell people is, you know, there's this perception that all of the crabgrass germinates in April, and so you have to have down your pre-emergence herbicide or it's too late. And, you know, that is the case, but on the other hand, if you see a crabgrass plant or two, I would not tell you don't bother with the pre-emergence herbicide this year, just use post-emergence products, because again, the primary flush of germination is in May and June. And so if you miss a couple of those early season plants, it's not as bad as not putting down a pre-emergence herbicide and letting it all germinate. So we usually tell people that crabgrass germinates after soil temperatures reach the upper 50s, okay? For like 3 nights in a row. At our research center, that's almost always the third week of April, like April 22nd, or regardless of the type of spring that we're having. And I mention that because, you know, we typically tell people to put down the pre-emergence herbicide when they see this shrub blooming, right? Forsythia, so bright yellow flowers on bare wood, they're pretty common. They're pretty noticeable when you're driving by. So when you see this flowering, that's, you know, what we tell people is their cue that it's time to put out their pre-emergence herbicide. Well, because of the weather that we're having this spring, these are in fact blooming. And so, you know, we would tell people, okay, it's time to put out the pre-emergence herbicide. But again, if it accidentally goes down just a little bit too late, you know, like I'm planning to start all of my pre-emergence herbicide trials at our research center next Thursday, April 15th. And, you know, I'll be fine with that because, again, the main flush of crabgrass germination is, you know, in May. The reason that I say that I put so much emphasis on maybe recklessly applying the pre-emergence herbicide late is that the products that we're using for pre-emergence weed control and turf grass are the same materials that have been on the market since 1994 or sooner. They're great products, but they don't last for forever after you apply them, right? Most of these products, depending on soil, the turf type, weather conditions, post-application, your application rate, etc., they're going to be good for, you know, 90 days, maybe 120. And so if you apply too early, you have the risk of having a lot of late season breakthrough. And then that's when you have more of a problem with, you know, crabgrass in the late summer months. So you should apply prior to seed germination. But again, if you see a crabgrass plant or two, I would say still put it down. And I think that's relevant this year because, again, you know, like we're having a really warm early spring, and so it might catch some people off guard. But again, if you see a plant or two, don't think, oh, it's too late. You know, go ahead and put it out anyway, because again, most of the crabgrass is going to come in May and June. The one thing also is to apply the product uniformly. If you under apply, you're obviously not going to get as good a control, but if you over apply, all of our pre-emergence herbicides act by inhibiting root formation, which is deadly on a seedling that's trying to germinate. But even for mature turf, if you over apply the product, you're going to stunt the growth of the roots, which is going to make it not as likely to persist through the you know, warmer, drier summer months in as good a condition as it could have been. And again, never underestimate the importance of using a pre-emergence herbicide. What you see here is the end of the year on my research plots at the Turfgrass Center. And what you see in this green square is where we put down a pre-emergence herbicide. Okay, all of these areas that are brown, those are crabgrass seed heads. That's where we were testing different post-emergence herbicide products. Post-emergence weed control has come a long ways for grassy weed control, but it has a ways to go. So if you have severe crabgrass pressure, again, pre-emergence herbicides are definitely something that you should use. If you're trying to save a little money, you know, that seed typically doesn't go travel that far in a mowed environment. And so where you had crabgrass last year is probably where you're going to have crabgrass this year. So again, the pre-emergence herbicides that we use, pendimethalin, prodiamine, and dithiopyr are the main three. They've all been around since at least 1994. The dipeptides, that's what's supposed to make corn gluten meal work as a pre-emergence herbicide. And that can work. You have to be very specific with the way that you apply that. But organic lawn care is something that if you do it correctly, you can get some weed control with that. Isoxaben is a pre-emergence herbicide for broadleaf weeds, occasionally used in turf grass. Siduron I have in bold here because that's one that you can use if you are attempting to establish from seed. Again, the dinitroanilins, they're all older materials, pendimethalin, prodiamine, dithiopyr. These are all the products that when you go to purchase to do lawn weed control, the step 1 in the 4-step program, it's usually going to be one of those active ingredients. But again, remember with pre-emergence herbicides, the idea is to make it so that that barrier lasts for the entire time that crabgrass might be germinating. So anytime from about the 20th of April through the end of June is when you might see crabgrass germinating. Most of it's going to be in the month of May. But after you apply that product, it will start to degrade. And after the concentration goes below a certain minimum threshold in the soil, that's when you're going to start to see breakthroughs. So if you put the product on too early, there's a chance that you're going to have premature breakdown, and that's again when you're going to have those kind of problems with late season crabgrass. Always make sure that you read the label. Make sure that you're looking at any site or usage restrictions. The reseeding interval in particular is the one that's probably of most relevance to us when we're talking about controlling lawn weeds, because again, a lot of people will try to seed at this time of year, and every year I get some sad, tragic story of an individual that their yard is completely barren. Their plan was to put down seed, but they had a lawn care operator come in and they accidentally did the 4-step program, step 1, all over the bare soil, which might prevent the crabgrass from coming in, but it's also for a period of up to 6 months going to prevent any turfgrass seed from coming in too. So recognize that these products, in addition to controlling crabgrass germination, will also control desired turf grasses. The one exception is a product called mesotrione, which is sold, among other things, as a herbicide called Tenacity. That can be used. The idea there is that you prepare the seed bed properly, you seed, put down your starter fertilizer, and then apply the mesotrione as a spray, and then mulch over the top of that and start watering. If all goes well, the only thing that germinates is the cool season grass, and then it suppresses, annual broadleaf weeds, warm season grassy weeds, sedges. In many situations that can work, it can work well, but sometimes, especially if you're trying to establish Kentucky bluegrass from seed, even the use of that herbicide isn't enough to prevent you from, having crabgrass and other weeds take over that spring establishment. Okay, during the month of May then is when we typically attempt to control our broadleaf weeds post-emergence. It's when people do it because that's when they notice them. Agronomically, it's not when you're supposed to do it, but it is, when people, for better or worse, attempt to control them. Again, the list of plants that we primarily concern ourselves with in turf is relatively restricted because of the mowing heights. There's just so many plants that can grow at 4 inches or below, in a mowed environment. The one that we're mostly concerned with in home lawns is dandelions, not because they're difficult to control with herbicides, but just because they're so ubiquitous. You see dandelions everywhere, tremendous capacity to reproduce. We also see a lot of white clover. And again, this is a perennial weed. There's some other clover-like species that we see in home lawns like oxalis, which is a warm season annual, and black medic, which is a cool season annual. But white clover is the one that's a perennial. And then also the plantains. So either black seed plantain or buckhorn plantain. I would say that these are the weeds that we see most commonly in a home lawn situation. And when you have those weeds, then broadleaf herbicides that contain any of the active ingredients that I have highlighted in this red box will be effective. So the older post-emergence products that contain like 2,4-D, MCPP, and dicamba. There's a lot of professional products that lawn care operators have access to, but homeowners can also get a variety of materials that have those ingredients. And again, the 2,4-D is in there for dandelion control, the MCPP for clover. The dicamba is in there for the occasional more difficult weed. And if again you've got just a moderate amount of pressure with some dandelion, some clover, some plantain, then those herbicides will work very well for you. Now, one thing to mention is that oftentimes homeowners have access to granular products and liquid products. So the granulars are available as, like the step 2 in a 4-step fertility program. They also have access to liquid herbicides. The one thing that I would say is that granular products for post-emergence control tend to not work particularly well. The idea is that those active ingredients are soil active. You can get absorption and uptake through the roots, but agronomically that is just not anywhere near as effective as the spray formulations. And so what I tell people is that if you have a relatively light amount of broadleaf weed pressure, and by light I mean like 10 to 15% coverage, no more than that, then granular products will probably be acceptable for maintaining that level of coverage in the lawn. You might get some reduction, but typically in my trials at OSU, I get 50, maybe 60% control using granular formulations of herbicides. If you have a substantial broadleaf problem that requires an actual reduction in the amount of coverage in the lawn, then the liquid herbicides are going to be what you're going to need to use. You will not meaningfully reduce the cover of broadleaf weeds in a lawn in most cases with a granular product. The liquid will be what you would need to use for that. Also, if you have difficult weeds, difficult to control weeds like creeping Charlie or Canada thistle or wild violet. So isn't it funny how a lot of our most difficult to control weeds are things that we introduced because we thought that they were pretty in the landscape, and then they ended up becoming a weed problem. Violets are one of those. But if you have any of those perennial weeds or any of these spring annual broadleaf weeds, a lot of the annual broadleaf weeds, we don't see them as commonly in turf, but they tend to also be more difficult to control with herbicides. So things like prostrate knotweed, plum and mallow, which is coming up in just a second, and then black medic. If you have some of these more difficult to control weeds, then there are products that are available to the home lawn market that contain some of the pyridinoxy herbicides, fluroxapyr, triclopyr, and quinclorac. Also some of the protox inhibiting herbicides, carfentrazone, sulfentrazone. And so here's a table that has some of those materials that homeowners can get access to. So they usually have whimsical names like Clover and Oxalis Killer, or Weed Beater Ultra, for example, or Scott's Roundup for Lawns. It's an interesting marketing strategy that they've started to use the trademark named Roundup to describe things that contain more than just glyphosate or something other than glyphosates. In fact, I do believe there is a Roundup insecticide that homeowners have access to now. It's important to read the label to make sure that you understand what it is that you're spraying, so that you don't accidentally confuse glyphosate with the Roundup for Lawns formulation. But these products are examples of materials that homeowners can get access to that have a little bit more power, if you want to say, to control some of the more difficult weeds that we see in our home lawns, things like wild violet and creeping Charlie. Now, skipping forward to the summer months, July and August, and again, we're just talking about what to do in the context of weed control. Hopefully you're managing the lawn correctly too, and by that I mean making an environment where the grass is competitive as possible. So proper fertility in the springtime, raising the height of cut so that grass that's being grown at 3 inches is a lot more competitive against weeds than grass that's being mowed at 2 inches or lower than that. But also with the irrigation management, I see a lot of homeowners that will let the grass go pretty dormant before watering it, so that it greens back up, and then they don't water it again until it goes dormant. And that can be quite destructive to the carbohydrate reserves in the crown of the plant and reduce the competitiveness of that grass stand against weeds. And so again, hopefully you've got proper management being practiced on those lawns, but in addition to that, some operations to concern ourselves with in the summertime would be some post-emergence control of grassy weeds and sedges and annual broadleaf weeds if we see them. Hopefully you don't have to go wall to wall with these, but primarily spot spray applications. So crabgrass, for example, if you see crabgrass, you want to try to control it before it has a chance to set seed. Seed heads are great for verifying identification, but generally speaking, you don't want them in the lawn, because that's what's going to make it more likely that you're going to have that weed problem again next year, right? Also, goosegrass is another one that we see in lawns, though less frequently than we see crabgrass. Has a completely different seed head on it, though. So, like I said, one idea is to make sure that you're looking at if you're having trouble identifying the grass, the seed head can be a great thing. Now, this is actually a barnyard grass seed head here, and then foxtail is another example of an annual grass that we'll see in lawns. And so when you have problems with the annual grasses and you need a post-emergence herbicide, there's not very many products that are registered for control. Okay, there's only these 4 materials. Quinclorac is one that can be used quite effectively against crabgrass. And then, all of those other grasses, usually we would want to use tepramazone or mesotrione on them. Now, some other grasses that you might see, and these are perennial grasses, things like orchard grass, quackgrass, nimblewill. Those are plants that we've had a problem with for many, many years. Some more recent introductions on home lawns, though, are field paspalum and then Johnson grass that survives lower heights of cut. So there is, we've always seen sporadically Johnson grass in home lawns that are mowed, but it's becoming a more frequent occurrence. But then field paspalum is a tropical grass that has encroached northward. Used to be more of a problem in the southern United States. Now we see it in Ohio as well. So this is Dallas grass or field paspalum. If you know what crabgrass looks like, the leaf blade is about twice the width. So, it's just that much more aesthetically displeasing in a home lawn. Good control option for that is this material, tepramazone, which is called Pilex. You may have to resort to, or actually for many years, I told people that they would have to resort to having a lawn care operator apply this herbicide, but there are now tepramazone formulations that are available to homeowners, so you can get access to those. Unfortunately, with most of the perennial grasses, though, things like orchard grass or quackgrass with the long clasping auricle. Quackgrass is pretty amazing in a lawn. This is a meter stick that I'm showing this rhizome up against. you know, these are grasses that not only, you know, compete very well with cool season grass, but we don't have selective herbicides for them. Nimblewill's a warm season grass that will persist over winter here, and also we don't have selective herbicides to control it. So if you see any of those, or if you have oftentimes, you know, some of our biggest grassy weed problems in turf are grasses that we should like, but they're growing out of place. So tall fescue growing in Kentucky bluegrass, or bent grass growing in Kentucky bluegrass, or if you have rough bluegrass, that's the one that suddenly goes dormant after it turns warm and dry, and you think that you have grubs, but it's actually just rough bluegrass that's gone dormant. All of these, you end up having to use non-selective herbicides to control these. And still recommending glyphosate. There was a review that was just completed that showed that once again, there is not evidence that glyphosate is a carcinogen, although there are 80,000 lawsuits pending in courts all over the United States. So, I mean, with all herbicides, you're supposed to follow the label and be pretty cautious about the use of the material. But my point in touting glyphosate is that it is the one systemic non-selective herbicide that we have. All of these other materials are contact in nature, so they would not give you permanent control. There are a couple of perennial grasses that you can attempt selective control. So paspalum, you can try Pramazone. But for the most part, when you have perennial grasses that you're trying to deal with, you're looking at using a non-selective herbicide, and then you have to renovate and reestablish. Sedges are something that we see in home lawns too. So sedges have edges, right, triangular shaped stems, leaves growing in 3 different directions. And if you see sedges, remember you have to use herbicides that are different than the ones that you would use to control grasses. And so there are nut sedge control products that homeowners do have access to. Sulfentrazone is a good product used by lawn care operators. And again, homeowners do have access to that active ingredient. Trying to think if we're talking about summer annual broadleaf weeds that germinate a little bit later, so things like pigweed, spurge, purslane. These are all weeds that tend to not germinate and start growing until it's warm. The cool season grasses have gone dormant. So think, you know, like the months of July and August is when you start seeing a lot of these. You'd use the same herbicides for broadleaf weed control as what I've talked about before, but the difference is that you want to make sure to spray these again before they have a chance to flower and set seed, so that you don't hopefully have as much of a problem with them in subsequent years. Control of those is also possible with a pre-emergence herbicide. The problem is that oftentimes these germinate after the pre-emergence herbicide that you apply to control crabgrass has worn off. All right, so in September, that's when we want to concern ourselves with seeding and overseeding the lawn. So, you know, like I said, fall always has been and will continue to be the best time of year to establish grass from seed. Soil is warm, the air temperatures are cooler. It's easier to keep the lawn adequately irrigated to favor germination. And so that's when you want to focus on that operation. And then finally, in October and November, this might be kind of counterintuitive, but agronomically, that's when you should attempt to control perennial weeds post-emergence. So if you've got weeds like dandelion and white clover and you see them in the month of October, don't ignore them until the following spring. That's when you want to try to control those. You get better translocation of the herbicide below ground into those structures that make that perennial weed a perennial, and you're more likely to get long-term control. Spring applications tend to control the top growth, and you feel good about that for about 8 weeks, and then the plant regenerates from the structures below ground that weren't adequately controlled by the herbicide. Also, winter annual broadleaf weeds have become much more of a problem. As evidence, just walk outside and look around. You'll see a lot of white blooming weeds in the lawn right now. Those are all winter annuals. If you have an issue with those, you can also use those October, November applications of post-emergence herbicides to attempt to control those seedlings before they have a chance to overwinter. You'll get much better control compared to trying to control those weeds now. And so again, fall is the best time to make those applications. Agronomically, they're more effective. Also, you're much less likely to cause a problem with drift injury to any of the ornamentals that you might have in your landscape. And if you're going to try to control late, know that herbicides come in a couple of different formulations. The esters are the ones that tend to be more effective in cooler weather. Applications that you're going to make in temperatures 60 degrees and below should be ester formulations. Use the amines in warmer temperatures. And again, these are those winter annual broadleaf weeds, common chickweed, henbit. Those are a big problem for us. But this is the last picture that I wanted to show you. And what this is an area where I sprayed post-emergence herbicides, the dark green area that's just turf grass. I made this application for a research project on the 20th of November in 1 year. It was like 45 degrees and misting lightly. And you see this is the following spring, and you see that the control is 100%. 45 degrees and misting lightly seems like a dumb time to try to apply a herbicide, but the idea is to get as much of the herbicide into the weed as possible to translocate below ground. And so that wasn't enough precipitation to knock the herbicide off of the leaf, and you ended up having a long time to get the herbicide into the leaf tissue. When you make applications of herbicides when it's warm, like even in May, sometimes what can happen is that the formulation dries before you get enough of the herbicide into the plant, and then that negatively affects control. And so, the fall applications, when you have perennial broadleaf weeds, winter annual broadleaf weeds, really that can be more effective. This area where I did this trial remained weed-free for 11 months, versus what I said, the typical amount of control that you get with a springtime application is 6 to 8 weeks. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of the things that I would focus on going month by month when attempting to manage lawn weeds. Again, I know that this is maybe a little bit different type of presentation than what you would normally be watching, but if you own a lawn, hopefully I was able to provide some information that was of use. Are there any questions?
Well, thanks, Dr. Gardner. I'm looking at our screen. We had one that was up there, was asking about, they had trouble hearing about the seeding, and it was about the time frame, August, September. Was that the best time to seed or not? And I think you've already answered that question multiple times. And actually, that time frame is better on that.
August 15th to September 1 is when I would attempt to, or August 15 to October 1 is the window for seeding. So about a 6-week window to establish turf from seed. And again, the whole idea there is that it's a more hospitable environment for seed growth because you've got warm soil, cooler air temperatures. You can get away with irrigating once a day to keep the soil moisture adequate for germination. And you don't have a lot of weed pressure. Crabgrass isn't trying to germinate. It's just an easier environment to get seeds to establish in.
Okay, and then the next question we had was, what herbicide was used in the trial that you showed there with the dandelions and that? It was done in November.
That was a commercial product, Speed Zone from PBI Gordon. But any 3- or 4-way herbicide that contains at least one ester will produce an identical result to what I showed in that photograph.
See, probably another thing about spraying in the fall like that too, that's plenty of time after typically most all the agricultural plants have always been hardened off and harvested at that time, so you don't have to worry about agricultural damage either.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. I actually had one question myself here too, as about sedges. If you have sedges inside of a flower bed and you have other type of seeds you're trying to establish, or other plants I'm trying to establish from seed, like seed dropping, kind of fill in things like that, what type of herbicide would you recommend for like sedge control?
It's the same active ingredients that I was showing in that presentation. I'm quickly now trying to go to a talk that I give and I'm not going to find it, a talk that I give for commercial applicators, but there's a variety of different sedge control products that the game is to look at the label and see what, if the sedges are growing in close proximity to your ornamental plants, you know, what the safety is over the top. A newer herbicide to check out, it's not new, it was registered in 2007. A newer herbicide to check out is Certainty. So that was originally registered for use in northern turf, and then they found that it's a little bit too phytotoxic on cool season grasses. So it had a label for use in southern turf, but then they changed the company that registered it. And when they made that change, they expanded the label to allow use in ornamental beds. And it does have it's systemic, and it does have an over-the-top label that's more substantial than some of the other products that we see. So halosulfuron will work well. The other one that works well is the sulfentrazone, but those you have to be careful. You can't get those in contact with any ornamental plants that are in the bed. So that Certainty herbicide is one that has a little bit more extensive of an over-the-top label to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much on that. See if anybody else has any other questions, please type them in the question box here. Kind of checking it real quick here. I don't know if any other panelists had any questions for Dr. Gardner.
Nope, I'm just gonna go out and water my grass seed that I planted because I had some driveway work done. It had dirt spots next to it.
Everybody has a situation where they have to establish in the springtime, but it's a lot more difficult to water, and then, you know, the weed control can sometimes be more cumbersome. But when we're doing establishment studies at OSU, when we do spring establishments, you know, like if we start at June 1 or something, we have to irrigate 5 times a day to keep the soil adequately moist, which is fine because, you know, we've got an irrigation system on a computer controller. But if I was a homeowner, or, you know, like if I was doing my yard, I would not want to have to worry about spritzing the yard 5 times a day.
Right.
September, it's like you can water once at 4 in the afternoon and it's good to go, you know, for 24 hours. So it just makes it easier.
I think it was a very good point about the 4-step program too. I can't imagine how many people have had crabgrass preventer and then try to establish grass seed after that. It's just going to be enormous on that. So I guess one other thing I was going to remind everybody of is that if you haven't done it so already, if more than one person is watching this presentation that has a pesticide license that's at that location, please make sure that you email that your name and your license number to james.cook@ohio.gov. And if you're an ISA certified arborist and you like ISA credits, please email them your name and also your ISA number on that. But as for questions, I have no more questions. So thank you very much, Dr. Gardner. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.
Yep.
All right. Well, that was our last speaker of the day. Thanks everybody for attending. Thank you to the speakers for speaking and increasing our knowledge on their topics. And that's all I have. Mike, do you got anything from the LTAP side of the house?
Just wanted to say thanks, Jim and Scott, and thanks everybody for your participation today.
Yep. I'd like to thank Mike for hosting all this stuff with the LTAP, who made it possible. So, thanks a lot. Everybody have a great day.
You too.